Hello and welcome to my presentation. I am so excited to be here today to talk about rattlesnake avoidance with you. All these presentations so far have been wonderful. I hope you've been enjoying yourself as much as I have been. Thank you again to Yo and Michelle for inviting me to be here today. My name is Eileen Koval, and I'm a certified dog behavior consultant with the IAABC and the CCPDT, as well as a certified professional dog trainer. And I had gotten interested in rattlesnake avoidance through positive reinforcement, sort of because of my own needs living out here in Las Vegas. So let's go and I'll talk a little bit about myself first so you can see how I got into dog training and a little bit about my background before we dive into the rattlesnake avoidance part. So a little bit about me. Dog training and behavior consulting wasn't my first field that I was in. I went to college, I got my BA in history and geography, I got my master's in operations management, which is like an industrial engineering type field. I worked for the government doing intelligence for, it was like 8 or 10 years. And I enjoyed myself for a while, but eventually I found dog training because after a few different moves, one of my dogs was having some serious fear and anxiety issues that were impacting her quality of life. It's one of those situations where she just seemed fearful existing. And she's in a Netherlands, a Quaker Hunja. They're more sensitive type dogs. And, it was very rough on her. So we were really fortunate to be living in Florida at the time in the Panhandle and came across Debbie Ravel, who is a certified dog behavior consultant, as well as an associate certified cat behavior consultant with the IAABC. And we worked with her, and it just totally changed my life as well as my dog's, because I saw how, this can be addressed through understanding the dog, like looking at it holistically and through positive training, and it changed her life around, and it really piqued my interest in this career field. At the time, I was still all into, intelligence work. I really dedicated myself to my career, but I started continuing to pursue dog behavior and training. I got involved with scent work, got involved with agility. We didn't have a lot of options available for scent work where we were at in Florida, so I was pursuing that online and with my own training with the dogs, and I did agility at Debbie Ravel's facility. Then eventually for my husband's job with the military, we moved to Las Vegas, and I started teaching agility here and eventually opened Confident Canines, doing behavior consulting as well as teaching agility and obedience and manners, and then rattlesnake training. So what led me to rattlesnake avoidance training? So life in the desert. Rattlesnakes here, they're a reality. Like you can try to avoid them, but they get into places, they get into suburban backyards, people see them on the sidewalks, on walks. Rattlesnakes just exist here, there's no way around it. And it doesn't matter if you're in the city or you're on the outskirts. We are more on the outskirts of the city, with a larger property, so it's a little bit more of a concern for us. But I've had plenty of clients who've, they've found them in their backyard or their dogs found them, and they're in the middle of the city in like a neighborhood. So, it's a concern for everybody here. And we have so many different types too. There are like 5 common different types of rattlesnakes here. And, there were a lack of suitable training options too, because I was looking around, and here in the city, all that existed was shock collar training. And for me, that's not really an option. My dogs are really sensitive. I'm not for using shock regardless for that anyway. I've never used shock on a dog. I'm not going to use shock on a dog. And plus, like, it wasn't worth it for me. But at the same time, I felt backed into a corner. I felt like, well, what option is there than just have my dogs at risk? And, that's something that I've had so many conversations with other people over the years. Some of them who did end up taking their dogs to these shock collar clinics, and they just felt like there weren't options. And they want to protect their dogs, and so many of them went through with it. And some of them dogs have had problems afterwards. Other ones they didn't. And luckily none of them have, that I know of have ever encountered rattlesnakes, but there just weren't options available, and they felt backed into a corner to make a really tough decision. And a lot of people have said, you know, are rattlesnakes that one exception to LIMA, least invasive, minimally aversive methods, or to positive reinforcement? I don't think so. You know, like, we're going to talk about that a little bit more, but based on what I've done with my dogs and this, you know, protocol that I've developed, I don't think it is whatsoever. But at that time, I wasn't so sure. When we were considering this whole journey, I really wasn't sure, and that's what led me down it. But now I know that it's not the case. But, you know, it's one of those things you hear over and over, and you start to believe it's true, that, you know, dogs can't be trained to avoid rattlesnakes except through fear. So we're going to talk about some more later. But the one time I, you know, first heard of possibly using positive reinforcement on rattlesnake training was in an online forum of dog behavior consultants, and someone talked about how you could rent live rattlesnakes to use to train your dog, and I was like, you got to be kidding me, a live rattlesnake? And to me, I thought it was neat that people were actually exploring it to try to figure out other ways, but I'm thinking, you know, I've done scent work, it takes longer than just a day or two, or even a week to get a dog so reliable with that odor, to perform the behaviors over and over again, to make it, you know, repetitive, so it's an automatic response. And also you need probably more than one snake, even though, you know, the scent is specific to the species. Each individual snake smells a little bit different, just like each individual dog smells a little bit different. So it didn't seem feasible to me. And I also personally don't want to stress out the snake so much. Like, I try not to stress out helper dogs or helper people when I'm working with them. And I would hate to put so much fear into some poor rattlesnake that's in a cage or something, thinking some dog's gonna get it. But I was like, you gotta be kidding me. You can rent live rattlesnakes. But it got me down this path of exploring this a little bit more. So I was questioning, you know, is fear a requirement for avoidance? At the time, I thought, well, maybe. I'm not really sure. It seems like people haven't really delved into that, to explore that. Because even some of the positive trainers who have their own little, you know, group classes, some of them, not all of them, but some of them I was reading about were talking about trying to convey fear with your body language and with your voice, as if that was going to help bring about the behavior responses that we want from the dog. I disagree with that, and we're going to go into that a little bit more. But the biggest thing for me was that I needed off-leash reliability, because we have a small ranch here. And so, you know, I'm always outside with my dogs when they're out there. I don't like to leave them alone, not that they've escaped the property or anything, but there are things that they can get into. And, you know, there's coyotes, scorpions, all kinds of stuff. So I'm always outside there with them, but they may be 100 or 200 feet from me. So we can't really rely on me seeing that snake first and telling them to leave it. If it was that, you know, where I just had to, you know, take them on a walk, and, you know, maybe there's one sitting on the rock sunning itself, and all it was me telling my dogs to leave it. Okay, we've got that covered. Like, we have a fantastic leave it. But I needed more than that. I needed my dogs to be able to make their own judgment calls, make their decision that, oh, I see this stimulus, I'm supposed to perform this certain behavior and move away. So I needed that type of reliability with my dogs. So let's go into it a little more with creating my methodology. You know, I was not really sure what to think at this point. You know, I wasn't totally sure that I could get what I needed, you know, with just positive training, because I had this bias that I feel like a lot of us have, that you can't do this because, you know, it's been said over and over and over again that, you know, it can't be done. So we just believe it and maybe don't challenge it. Because I honestly believe that many of the people that are using shock on dogs to get them to avoid rattlesnakes aren't just nasty people or something. They actually really want to help the dogs not die, you know, from a rattlesnake bite and go through that trauma. They're wanting to help these dogs and owners, I believe, but perhaps they don't realize there are better ways. So try not to demonize people, because I do believe that a lot of us are wanting what's best for the dogs. Sorry about that. So what I did to get started was I contacted our regional herpetology society. I wanted to learn a little bit more about the snakes, the rattlesnakes. I wanted to learn a little bit more about scents and stuff like that. And they were just so excited that I didn't want to use a live rattlesnake. Because, you know, I guess a lot of these shock collar clinics, that's what they use. They use a live snake, usually a defanged one. And they were talking about how cruel the process was. And they were just overjoyed that I didn't want to use any live snakes at all. So they were very helpful. I researched dogs that are used to detect snakes for other purposes. Because there have been dogs that are used to find certain types of snakes, certain species in cargo containers that are invasive species in other countries, and they don't want that specific type of snake coming in and killing the wildlife. So that does exist, as well as some dogs that were formerly bomb sniffing dogs for the Air Force but failed out of the program, and then they're being used to, I'm not sure if it's still going on, but I know a few years ago it was going on, where they were using them to find pythons that people have just released because they didn't want them anymore into the Everglades, and they're devastating the ecosystem there. So dogs have been trained before to find certain species of snakes. It's not, you know, it's not a totally brand new thing. Like, it does exist, or they're using scent to find certain types of snakes. So, you know, then I delved into, well, what makes a snake bite a dog? Like, a snake doesn't, you know, it's not coiled up, sunning itself thinking, who am I going to bite today? Or, you know, who am I going to go after? You know, you see these cartoons or like the snakes chasing after the person. That's just not realistic at all. They bite because they're put into a sympathetic nervous system response where they feel that the only way to get out of there alive, like, because they're filled with fear, is to bite. You know, because they store up that venom and that energy to, you know, take down something to eat, to live. Like, they don't want to waste that energy in some fight with some other animal. They'd rather save that for finding food for themselves. So this really isn't something that the snake wants to do. They'd rather just, you know, leave you alone and leave your dog alone. So we need to make our dogs not seem like they're a threat, you know, invading the space, sticking their noses into the snake, or pawing where they're hidden under leaves or brush, pawing at it to smell it better. Those are the things that we don't want our dogs to do. So I had some background in scent work and, of course, in behavior modification, which was really helpful to figure out, well, how, you know, can I get those behaviors that I want to see? So I created a list of all the behaviors that I wanted out of the training and all the context that I wanted them to display. Because, you know, it looks very different, you know, all these different ways that we can see snakes. We can see them, you know, sitting on a roadway, sunning themselves. They might be on the side of a sidewalk. They might be on a raised surface where perhaps they're not so visible. They could also be hidden under a shrub. They could be under a rock or in a hole. There's so many ways that a dog can come across a snake. And they could also be in a way where it's blocking their path, where, you know, now suddenly your dog has less options, like to go around it. And so, you know, I wanted all these different ways where they have to go around it, they have to turn away and run away from it, the owner's in different locations. I just wanted to cover it all so that my dogs are prepared, you know, no matter what, no matter the placement, no matter the context, they know exactly what to do, whether I'm even there or not. So I created a specific step-by-step plan. And so the experiment began. And here were the results. So the answer is yes, yes, yes. It absolutely does work to create reliable behaviors in our dogs for rattlesnake avoidance through positive reinforcement alone. I did not use any fear, any intimidation with my dogs, no coercion. They think that what we call snake games is the most fun thing ever, which is why I created this and made it available to people back in August on demand on my website, because I figured there are other people that were like me and lived in an area where maybe they don't have a lot of options. You know, in-person training is always nice and it's always better, but I wanted there to be options available to people, because like I said, I think so many people feel backed into a corner where they feel there aren't options other than to shock your dog. And you know, not everybody is comfortable with that, and a lot of dogs don't do well with that. So the dogs, as you can see, effectively perform the behaviors that I was wanting with this training. So why train behaviors off leash? Because this is where I'm a little bit different than some of the other positive reinforcement trainers that are doing the rattlesnake avoidance. I do it entirely off leash from the very beginning, because I want there to be no way that I'm using that leash to somehow influence them to perform the behaviors. I want them making good choices from the get-go. And so I make things very, very simple at first. So, you know, they're doing this thing that I want over and over again, getting it right most of the time. Like, I try to be as errorless as possible with the training, so the dog's not making errors over and over. He just thinks this is fun, getting all the treats, and I'm gradually making it more difficult until now we have this finished product. Because our dog, they may be very far away from you when he encounters a rattlesnake. Like these people that live here in my area, in the suburbs, they let their dog out their doggy door, and hello, there's a rattlesnake that somehow slipped through the fence or through the gate, because we have a lot of cinder block walls here, but there's still openings for dogs to get into your yard and you don't realize it. For me, my dogs might be far away from me on the other end of our horse arena. And, you know, what am I going to do then? I can't see that snake. And another situation, like I hike with my dogs on leash, but a lot of people here hike with them off leash. So there's a really good chance that your dog is going to detect the rattlesnake before you do. And that's not just because they're far away. Our dogs have amazing noses. You know, they can see, or they can smell up to 150 your dog is likely to detect the rattlesnake before you do. So why train behaviors off leash? Your dog may be far from you when he encounters a rattlesnake. So like some of my clients around here, they have, I'm rattled. So the answer is yes, yes, yes. It absolutely works to use positive reinforcement to create very reliable avoidance of rattlesnakes with our dogs. As you can see, the dogs were effectively performing the behaviors we want with this training. The first several videos where you see green grass and shrubs and, you know, sunny days, like those ones were, those were recorded about 3 weeks into our training. There is a video towards the end where my youngest dog, Gilgamesh, went up to near a pile of pine needles. That was heavily buried on a very cold day that's dry, so it was a lot more difficult for him to get the scent. As soon as he did, he turned away from it. But that, he had not seen or smelled a rattlesnake in probably a few months. It was 2 or 3 months, and I placed that out there and he knew exactly what to do. This training is very good, very effective. So yeah, it can be done. It works. And now, like, here's the part where I'm a little bit different than other positive reinforcement trainers that I've seen with this, in that I do everything off leash from the very beginning, because I want my dogs performing the behaviors independently from the very get-go. And that's why we make behaviors really simple at first, and then they do it repetitively. They're having fun, getting all these rewards, and I'm gradually changing the criteria, making it more difficult. But as they do these things over and over, we're using the same brain cells, creating these neural pathways that I want to be, you know, just automatic responses when they smell the scent of the rattlesnake. So there's a lot of different reasons for this. And, you know, in the end, I don't want to be somehow in the training, you know, cueing my dog with the leash inadvertently either, which people do even when they don't think they're doing it. They're moving the leash around and their dog's responding. Because I want this all to be off leash. I'm counting on the fact that my dogs probably aren't going to be near me. So that's the next bullet. You know, your dog may be far away from you when he encounters a rattlesnake. Even if you don't hike off leash or have a big property, what if your dog goes out the doggy door and hello, there's a rattlesnake there that slithered in through the gate? That happens here in Las Vegas. You know, I saw my veterinarian. It was the last time I went there, it was probably a month or so ago, and she said that just in that week there have been 2 cases that she had treated at their clinic, which they both survived, but 2 dogs had been bitten, and they were very small dogs, you know, like under 10 pounds. One of them was somebody who was passing through the area and had stopped at the gas station that's next to their clinic, let out the little Yorkie to go to the median, which is all rocks here in Las Vegas, to go pee, and boom, like bitten by a rattlesnake, because the little Yorkie went up to sniff it. And then there was another one that was some small dog, and it was bitten, and they were on a large property like we have, where the dog, you know, was off leash and exploring. But, you know, these things happen so easily. And, you know, whether you're hiking off leash or the dog, you're in your backyard, or your dog's, you know, no matter where they are off leash or even on leash, and, you know, they stick their head under a shrub, they're likely to detect the rattlesnake before you do. You know, dogs have a lot more sensory cells and a lot more olfactory receptors than we do. You know, it depends on the breed, but on average, it's over 150 million olfactory sensory cells, whereas humans just have 5 to 10. This really varies by breed. As you know, some breeds smell a lot better than others, but the shape of the dog's face and muzzle does impact, you know, their ability to do that job. That's why so many of these hounds have certain, you know, the longer but a little bit wider muzzles, because it gives more surface area in the nasal cavity for these olfactory sensory receptors. You know, you think of like a bloodhound or a beagle or a basset hound and the shape of their nose. And, you know, that really helps them have an edge with the job that they were bred to do. So they may be able to smell these snakes a little bit better than others, but, you know, dogs just on average have so much more than we do. Whether, you know, it's a Rottweiler or a Yorkie or, you know, a bloodhound, they all have an edge on us. Then there's a whole issue of, you know, mucus and moisture are key. So the mucus inside their nasal cavity traps those scent particles, so that, you know, the olfactory receptors can actually process them and figure out what the smell is. For, you know, a lot of dogs, they have to do more than one little sniff to fully, you know, gain enough scent particles to process that smell, which is what you saw with Gilgamesh in that last video. He went up to the edge of that little pine needle pile, did like 2, maybe 3 little sniffs, and he's like, oh, wait, that's a snake, and turned. So instead of pawing at it, trying to burrow into there, like, ooh, I want to check this out, he did his behavior he's supposed to. Moisture is the other key. So I don't know if you've seen hunters before, but when it's really dry, tough weather, they'll go and wet the nose of the dog to help them scent a little bit better. Obviously, every time we go outside, I'm not going to be wetting my dog's noses, but it does impact the ability for them to get those smells, because the smells have to be dispersed by, you know, moisture. And if there's not moisture in the air, then, you know, it might stay in one area. And if it's colder too, it tends to stay in one area versus warm air rising and dispersing. Eyes versus smell. This one's a kind of crazy one. You know, people talk about dogs' bad eyesight, but it's not really bad eyesight, it's just different eyesight than ours, because they need to, you know, historically to see better at night, you know, during the whole evolutionary processes. You know, they see colors differently than we do. They go off of smell a lot more. So your dog they're not going to just look at a coiled snake, regardless of what it is. Most likely, they're not going to be like, ooh, that's a snake, I better avoid that. They're going off of the smell. I don't know if you've ever seen this, but I have numerous times in my behavior practice where a dog sibling comes home from the vet and the sibling dog attacks that dog because he smells different. He doesn't recognize that it's him. You know, even though he's lived with this dog, he smells different, even though he looks the same. And actually, I saw this with some human-directed aggression, which then the dog's like, once they realize it's a human, they're like, oh gosh. But with this pandemic, people are using all kinds of Lysol sprays on themselves when it first happened, and they really weren't sure how COVID was spread. People are using hand sanitizer like crazy, but people put this stuff at their front doors, and before they come in the house, spraying themselves all over. And there were a few cases that I had where somebody would come in the door and the dog's growling at them or nipping at their leg because they don't realize that it's their person, even though they look the same. So dogs really do go off a smell. So I think that that should not be forgotten when figuring out how we want to train this, because we want to make sure our dogs are actually detecting it. Because if they don't detect the rattlesnake, they're not going to avoid it. So if we focus on just the sight of the snake, we're really missing a big piece of the puzzle. So as I mentioned, rattlesnakes, they hide under shrubs, leaves, rocks. So we're not going to see that. Our dogs are going to notice it. They're low to the ground. They have these amazing noses to, you know, smell and process this information. So we need to give them the tools and understand like the expectations for that. We need to teach our dogs to make the desirable choices and make these judgment calls. Because, you know, if he's 10 feet from a snake, is that a safe distance? Or if it's 2 feet away a safe distance. We need to pick a distance. We need to train them, you know, what we want to do, like how close is too close. These are the things that we need to teach our dogs. So evaluating the training options, you know, whether positive, training on leash, training off leash, or using shock or some other type of fear or aversion. When considering any training, we have to ask ourselves, what's the end result that we want? So that's what I've been trying to list out before I started with the training, like what behaviors do I want? And then after that, I asked myself, you know, well, what's the best way to create that? Just like we do with any sort of behavior case as behavior consultants. So for me, the end result was that I want a dog who can be off leash outside, and if he sees a rattlesnake, he knows to move away and avoid it. You know, if I somehow tell him like, come on, go on over there, go on, you know, go on to your crate or go on to this area, that he will look at me and be like, no, I'm not going over there. I want a dog who's willing to disobey me if I tell him to go in the path. Like if we're on some hiking trail, which I hike with my dogs on leash, but you know, even if they're on a leash, they can still be within distance of a rattlesnake and I don't know it because it could be covered up. But, you know, I'll tell my dogs to go on or let's go, let's walk, you know, if they keep them moving forward. And if there's something there, I want them to be like, no. And if you do this training, you very quickly pick up on what your dog's signal is, that there's something there. And so, you know, I have dogs, and I think a lot of dogs are like this, who have good relationships with their owners, that they would jump off a cliff with me. Like if I told them to do whatever, like something crazy, something dangerous, they'd be like, okay, mom, you know, like they just go along with it. And since dogs aren't naturally fearful of snakes, which we'll talk about that a little more later, they don't know to be afraid. And, you know, so I want them to disobey me. And I think that's another reason some people are, you know, into the shock training, because they're like, well, I want my dog to be afraid. There are certain things to be afraid of, but there's a cost to that. And so we have to consider, well, what's the best way to create that? Because I want to create it in a way that's not going to stress out my dog. I want these behaviors, but I want to have that good relationship with my dog. I want to have confident dogs. I want the behaviors to be reliable. I don't want it to be a toss-up, whether they're going to choose fight or flight or freeze. I want to know they're going to do this every time. And I don't want to sacrifice their confidence or well-being. So when considering the options for training, here are some things we should consider. Does the method of training benefit mostly one member of the team? Like, for example, like how much time to train? There's this folly of this instant gratification. And I keep running into this. Like, I've had so many people contact me about the training, and a lot of people take the training and they're happy and stuff. But some people are like, well, how long will it take? And I tell them a few weeks. And they're like, what, really? Like, they seem to think it'll take like an hour or a weekend. I've been contacted about workshops, and people are upset when I tell them, like, because I'm a very realistic person. I would rather tell you it's going to take longer than it will, because I don't want you to somehow think, oh, my dog's done, they're trained, and then you take them out and they get bitten. I want you to be rock solid with this. And, you know, I've been contacted for workshops, and I'm like, yeah, I'll be happy to do a workshop, but your dog is not going to be rock solid with these behaviors at the end of the weekend. You're going to have to keep practicing them. You will have the skills. And then, you know, over time, your dog will have these behaviors down, because it's about repetition to build, you know, these solid automatic responses, because we're creating neural pathways that you know, that takes time. You have to use these same you know, brain cells over and over again, keep doing the same thing, so that becomes the automatic go-to response for that dog. And anybody who does scent work knows it takes time to build obedience to that odor, where they smell it and they know exactly what behaviors to perform. It does not happen in an hour or 2 hours. And that's part of the appeal of this shock training for rattlesnake aversion, is that you go to one of these clinics, you spend 10 minutes, and boom, like, it's supposedly done. But do you really know if it's done or not? That's the other thing. Your dog's been with one snake, and you don't really know how they've internalized that experience. So you're not really sure. But there's this appeal that, you know, oh, I just take my dog to a clinic, I spend an hour or two, and then it's over. And, you know, any worthwhile behavior that we teach our dogs takes time. It takes time to teach and proof it. Think of how long it takes to get an amazing recall, where you can just call your dog off of anything, anywhere. You know, whether you're in your house, you're at a busy park, you know, on a trail, at a dog park, places where there's distractions. Because think of how many distractions are out there when you're in a place where there could be rattlesnakes. There's just so many behaviors that are worthwhile, but they take time. Even sit. Like, that's the funny thing. Like, I thought about this, and I'm like, gosh, even sit. When people are teaching puppies, they get it down in the house, and, you know, their dog starts sitting, and, you know, then they're like, well, my dog won't sit without a treat. Well, then you know, I get them to wean away that reward, and in place of put other rewards in place. But then you go out in public, and your dog's so distracted by everything going on. And even a simple little behavior like that takes time. But this is one of those things that if you are in a place where there's a good chance that you may encounter a rattlesnake, it's worth it. It's worth the time, and it's worth the effort. And it uses foundation behaviors that you either use already and your dog knows, or you wish you had them because they are useful in so many other areas of your dog's life. And so that you'll enjoy that. But it's just one of those things that we easily fall for, you know, the folly of instant gratification. We just wish things were less work because we all have busy lives. And, you know, another thing is this training feasible for the average person? You know, because I'm creating training that I want people to do. I don't want to make it so difficult that only someone who's a highly advanced professional can do. I think it is feasible for most people if they have some type of basic training skills. Obviously, it might be a little easier for a professional, but I think anybody can do it. I've had numerous pet parents sign up for it, and they've been able to do it and have successful results. And, you know, the reliability of the end result is a big one for me. You know, with shock training, you don't really know what you're going to get. Like, you don't know how your dog's internalizing that experience, if they are going to maybe, you know, you hope that they're going to flee when they see a rattlesnake because they're like, oh gosh, bad things happened last time I saw a rattlesnake. But some, you know, some dogs, they see something that makes them fearful and they want to go after it to tell that thing, you go away, you get out of here. If every dog fled from things that made them afraid, I would probably have a lot less work than I do, because I work so many reactivity cases, you know, dogs going after other dogs, lunging on the leash or at strangers, because they want space and they want those other things to go away, but they are not choosing a flight option. They are very much choosing a fight option to make it, or put up, a tough guy stance to make it go away. And so you don't really know after the shock training what you're going to get. With this, we practiced it over and over in lots of different situations. And so, nothing's ever guaranteed, whether you use shock or whether you use positive. But I feel a lot better with this result, from the positive. And then, the other thing to consider is the stress and the difficulty, both for the human, the dog, and then the helper, the snake. So like I mentioned before, I'm not really into using the live snakes. The Herpetology Society, they offered for me to use live snakes because I guess they use them for people learning to handle snakes to take them off of people's property. But he admitted that the snakes would be pretty stressed out, but he didn't think it would be too bad. He was just so happy that I wasn't using like the defanged ones, because the amount of stress to the defanged ones, and they often end up dying from the stress of the whole, having their fangs cut off. And so he was so happy about that. He's like, oh, you can use one of our cage snakes. But just for me, if I'm using a human helper with a dog that say is, doesn't like men as much, I'm not going to make that person so afraid for their life with some dog that's there, snarling at them or something. I'm not going to create a situation where that one person is super afraid, nor would I do that to a dog. I used helper dogs before with reactivity cases. I've used human ones with territorial cases and whatnot. And it's never a situation where somebody's like super afraid. We try to lessen the amount of response that we have from the dog so that, they're not doing like a fight response. But then we also, shape the situation so that nobody's in that situation where they're like, oh no, am I going to get bit or am I going to get seriously hurt? It should never be that way. And I'm a non-speciesist kind of person, or at least I try to be. So I extend that to snakes as well. I don't feel like they should be put in that situation. So we get the sense from other sources to make sure that we're getting quality training, but not stressing out any dog, whether it's our own or somebody else's or a person or a snake. And then the long-term effects, like those have to be considered with the training. So, with this training, you get to build your relationship with your dog. You're getting to have fun experiences together. You're getting to understand how your dog thinks and processes information and reacts to things. You're getting to know your dog better. You get to read how he responds and how he cues you, like, oh, there's a snake here, and then working on those responses you want. So you have to learn how to communicate that to him effectively. And each dog is different, with how they understand like that communication. And I had 3 different dogs that are all the same breed, and each one is a little bit different. Just a little bit here and there, and if they're not getting it, we tweak what we're doing. And then, once we see that light bulb go off and they get it, then we, gradually make it more difficult. So you're getting to build your relationship though with the dog, which to me is what having a dog is all about, and doing training. It's fun, getting to learn about each one of them and forming that unique relationship bond. With the shock training, I think people are really trying to protect their dogs from danger, but there's this fine line like between creating an event that's traumatic enough and scary enough that they're not going to want to go near a snake. Well, hopefully they're not going to try to fend off the snake, like you go away kind of thing. But you have to make it scary enough, but then at the same time not so scary that your dog just has this negative fallout from it. And there's also the timing of the shock, because you don't know, even if they have perfect timing with that shock, there are other people in the room. Your dog has his harness on. The owner very possibly is there. There are other people there, other dogs. What is your dog going to associate with that? And that's the big issue that I see with it in my behavior cases is they've associated something else with the shock. Occasionally, like I've seen, actually more than occasionally, it's too much that I see these cases where I think somebody's had real bad timing with that shock, and some of these dogs don't know what to avoid because they don't know why they were shocked. Maybe, and these ones typically aren't ones with a snake, but I have seen ones that had problems after a snake. But you know, some of these shock trainers, like, you don't know who it is like doing it and what their timing is like, or if they're having an off day. And it's just not one of those things. Like, if I give a treat at the wrong time, okay, you got a freebie. You know, maybe he thinks that he gets a treat for like licking something off the floor. Like, that's not a great association, but it's one that's a lot less damaging than a dog who just randomly got shocked and he's like, oh my God, I don't know how to avoid it in the future. I'm afraid to breathe. I'm afraid to go on a walk. I'm afraid to be near my owner, because he can associate it with all these different things. So it's something to be considered. So dog behavior around snakes. You know, many domestic dogs are just naturally curious about snakes. The one exception I see to that is livestock guardian dogs. Thank you to Erin Williams in Australia, who has been such a wonderful source of information to me about livestock guardian dogs. You know, they are the type that they've been selectively bred to guard their flock, you know, to locate and frighten away snakes. The rest of other dogs, I don't see do that. Erin has this amazing video that she showed me in a course that I took of hers. She had some seminar that she gave where it showed a livestock guardian dog who found a snake and was trying to frighten it away, just barking at it, going crazy. It was really neat because that's not what I see with any other types of dogs. I see some dogs before that, once the snake starts moving, they get triggered with prey drive and want to go after it. But most dogs that I see, they see the snake just, you know, sunning itself there or hiding from the heat, and they go over and they smell it. They push their little noses into it or they paw at it, and then that's when they get bit, like in the face or the neck, sometimes on the paw, and it's because of that curiosity. So yeah, you know, sometimes you see some treated as prey. It tends to be some type of terrier when I hear about that happening, but not always, but usually a terrier. And then there's the livestock guardian dogs who want to guard. They want to keep their owner safe, or they want to keep their flock safe, you know, whether it's other dogs or if it's sheep that they're protecting. And they've been selectively bred for that. Other dogs have not been. They're not, to my knowledge, any dogs that were bred specifically to hunt snakes. You know, so most of them don't treat them as a threat. So is it important for the dog to fear the snake? You know, that's the big thing that I've heard over and over again, to the point that it was like a bias of mine before I really went and looked at all this. I'm like, of course they have to fear the snake. Otherwise, you know, we have to babysit them in it. We have to create fear somehow, but we don't want to do it through shock, or, you know, how do we do that? And it's one of those things you just hear over and over. And, you know, the whole why they don't fear snakes, you know, that nobody's really sure. We don't know if it was bred out in domestication, because, you know, that's gone on for over 15,000 years that they've been living with people. Maybe it was no longer a threat, or there was a lack of a threat to them when canids were evolving, you know, before we domesticated them. Maybe there was a lack of a threat to create this like evolutionary pressure for innate fear. You know, maybe that wasn't created. There was no need for an innate fear, because yeah, sure, like some dogs may die from snake bites, but if it isn't so many dying from snake bites, maybe there's not enough evolutionary pressure. There was some study that was done about dogs that you know, were sniffing snakes before, and they were showing in the study about how they often use their right nostril when they show fear, and they had both venomous and non-venomous snakes in this study, but the dogs just seemed intrigued by the smell. And they mentioned that they would like to see it replicated with wild wolves. This was in the Applied Animal Behavior journal, and they mentioned they would like to see it replicated with wolves because they are curious, you know, is this a thing that was bred out, or is this just one of those things that there's no evolutionary selection for it. And I will say out here in the desert, coyotes, they hunt and kill rattlesnakes. And a coyote would most likely die if it was bitten by a rattlesnake, but they're so quick and they do kill them. Sometimes they eat them, sometimes they don't. But they do hunt and eat rattlesnakes. So aversion, it teaches fear, but it's not teaching the specific behavior that we want. Like I mentioned before, you're hoping that you're going to get that flight behavior, but that's not necessarily the case. So when you shock a dog or do some other type of really scary thing, you know, to activate a nervous like kind of response, like to create fear, it's activating the sympathetic nervous system response, which is that fight, flight, freeze. It's the body preparing itself for what, you know, it perceives as like a life-threatening danger and might possibly, you know, cause injury to the dog. Same thing with humans. You know, when you have something really frightening happen, there are changes in your blood pressure. You start, you know, breathing and rapidly, like a dog would pant. Your eyes dilate. There's this release of glucose into the bloodstream, you know, because you're preparing for a fight, like the fight for your life most, you know, very possibly. Even if it's just something like, you know, a near car accident or something bad at work, you get this sympathetic nervous system response. And it stresses you out. Like you're filled with all this epinephrine and this cortisol. It's not a pleasant feeling. And, you know, dogs may choose a fight response instead of a flight response. Some of this is genetic, some of it's learning. If anybody follows Kim Brophy, she's got her little legs model, learning, environment, genetics, and self. There's no way to really know like which one your dog is going to choose. Like it could be, you know, a variety of different factors there, but your dog may choose a fight response instead of a flight response. And so teaching fear isn't a guarantee. Like even if your dog's scared to death of that snake, it doesn't mean he's gonna run away from it. And then there's the whole negative fallout possibility where your dog may associate other things that are in the vicinity with the shock and, you know, may not wanna, may be afraid of the owner, be afraid of his harness, may be afraid of going out of the house. Like there are so many things that could happen. And it's that fine line between making the experience so traumatic that you create just enough fear or making it so traumatic that your dog just can't exist. Like he's just so fearful of living. So avoidance teaches specific behaviors, specific trained behaviors associated with a flight response. I teach several of them because like I mentioned, you know, the snake could be blocking their path. You know, you don't know where it's going to be. So I want them to have several well-versed ones that they can perform. So examples of teaching avoidance without fear include, you know, when we teach dogs to stay out of certain rooms. This one's real common with some of my clients. They don't want their dogs to go down a certain hallway, or they don't want them to go upstairs, or don't want them to stay in the kitchen. And we do that without fear because it's a rewarded behavior pattern that they do over and over, and it just forms this neural pathway that they, you know, perform and they associate with pleasure, like good responses, you know, because it's a good pattern for them because they've gotten rewarded for it so many times. We also do this with guide dogs, avoiding walking under poles or objects or not crossing the street when there are cars coming. You know, we do this too without using fear. I doubt that they have guide dogs watch videos of, you know, cars hitting people to teach them like, oh, you shouldn't cross the street. No, instead, like when the dog waits when a car's trying to approach, like they reward them, or they start, you know, by having them stop like at a certain place and rewarding them, then add the pole at like a lower level, then make it more difficult raising the pole and training the dog to stop. So, you know, of course, like there are judgment calls in there, which is what we'll talk about a little bit later. Like, well, how far away is it okay for the car to be for me to cross the street? Or how high does the pole need to be for it to be safe for me and my human to walk under? Like those are the judgment calls that we also have with this rattlesnake training. But you can train your dog to effectively be able to make those calls. So some other examples of teaching avoidance without fear include training avoidance of other dogs. Like I do that with dogs who have reactivity or aggression issues all the time. I've done it, with one of my own dogs. He doesn't really like strange people. So he'll look at them and, if they start to approach, he turns and moves away. I've done that with other people's dogs if they don't like a certain other dog in the house. We most certainly work long-term to get them to like each other or at least coexist peacefully. But sometimes the first thing I do is train them, okay, you see that dog enter the room, let's turn and walk over to this area. So they see a dog, see a stimulus, turn and move away. And then once they've just relaxed about that whole situation, they're no longer filled with the stress and, anger or fear. When they see the other dog, it could be a variety of reasons why they don't get along with the other dog. But once some of that emotion's dissipated, because there's been all this reward associated with seeing that other dog and moving away, then we can work on some of these other aspects of that relationship. But this is avoidance without fear. Service dogs are trained to avoid food on the floor. And, some people do that using platforms or, keeping the dog's orientation more upwards, but we do this without fear. It's just behavior patterns that we've created that are filled with reward. So, rattlesnake avoidance, what is it then? It's teaching the dog to deliberately choose to move away from a particular stimulus, which is the rattlesnake, visual, scent, or noise, as soon as he detects or identifies it. That's the key. He's got to detect it. He's got to identify it. So we have to teach him that part, because if he doesn't know it's there, or he doesn't recognize like, oh, that's the thing that I'm supposed to move away from, then he doesn't know. So we have to teach him that. But we have to teach the identification. We have to teach the movement away from it. And that's avoidance. So we do this using neural pathways, as I mentioned a couple times, and those are formed when the brain cells communicate frequently, doing the same task over and over again. We do this all the time with our own habit patterns, waking up at the same time, going and making coffee, putting on your makeup, grabbing your keys before you go out the door. These are all habit patterns that we do over and over again, and we form these neural pathways through repetition, and then those behavior responses just become automatic. And that's why this positive training is so good, because your dog just automatically goes and does these things if he's done it so many times and it's been rewarded and it's pleasurable, which is why I like to do this airless training too, making things simple and making it more difficult, because that means he's doing it over and over and over again, which is what we want. So the things that we train several different avoidance behaviors. We train them to identify the rattlesnake, and we introduce it visually, but I recognize that the dogs are most likely going to identify it through scent. And so I like to use a variety of scents, so they generalize rattlesnakes, at least the ones that we have in our area. And if people are in other areas, I talk to them how to do that too. Because you may have different types of rattlesnakes, or maybe different types of poisonous snakes you want to use this for. You can even use this for toads. It's anything that your dog can smell and then avoid. But we also train them to put the two together so that the scent of the snake is cueing the dog, or the visual of the snake is cueing the dog to perform this pattern of behaviors. So you have to put those two together. Otherwise, we're always having to verbally cue it, or give them like some body language prompts. We want the snake itself to be the cue. Then this is the next part where my course is a little bit different, I think, than some of the other ones I've seen. We're teaching them to ignore the owner's cues or prompts to move towards a snake. Because if you're on some hiking trail and your dog is refusing to move forward, and you tell him, go on, or let's walk, let's go, and he's not wanting to move, I don't want him to go forward and move towards that snake. I want him to avoid that rattlesnake no matter what. And you will learn to recognize your dog's little signs and cues that there's a snake there. So this part is really important, because sometimes people think, oh, my dog's just being obstinate. And there's a reason for every behavior. And, you know, if you're out in some enjoyable place and your dog's just refusing to move forward, there's a reason for it to me. I had actually, this was not a rattlesnake story, but I had that one time shortly after we moved to Vegas. This was maybe a year afterwards. And we were on a walk, and my two dogs just all of a sudden wouldn't go forward anymore. And we were backed up to federal land, and then there was a neighborhood on the other side, and I couldn't see anything. I'm like, why are they being like this? And all of a sudden, a coyote darted out about 50 feet ahead, and it jumped over a wall into the community there. They had a golf course there, which there were lots of bunny rabbits at, but my dogs knew it. I had no idea. I had never seen one out on a walk like that before in broad daylight, and they knew, and they had froze. But one of them wanted to go the other way. The other one was frozen. So trust your dog. But this will teach you, you know, what to look for with your dog and teach your dog to perform the right cues. So I also create scenarios of varying difficulty in different contexts because, you know, it can be so much variety with where you're going to see a snake and making sure your dog's equipped to handle those situations. So the intelligent disobedience part. This is the part where your dog ignores your verbal or physical cues to move towards a snake because you don't know it's there, but he does. He knows it's there. This is more challenging, but very doable when it's broken down into steps. Because believe it or not, we already teach dogs to follow or to ignore our movement and body prompts in certain situations. We just don't really realize we're doing it sometimes. And it's not like these type situations aren't guide dog like level intelligence disobedience, which is what I think this rattlesnake stuff is. But you may already realize you've done some of this before. And so it's not, hopefully for you, it'll make you feel less intimidated by it. Because learning new things, like, it's intimidating, and sometimes we psych ourselves out with stuff like, I can't do that, or my dog can't do that, and don't give ourselves a chance with it. And, you know, we all make mistakes and learn them along the ways, but you never get to know whether you can do it or not unless you try. So I like to point out, like, hey, you may have already done some of the precursors to this before. Like, for example, if you have a dog who's trained to stop at open doors, to not see an open door as a cue to exit. Like, a lot of my clients have me train that, where they want the dogs to just stay at the door, just be trained that you don't have to say the word stay, they just know to stop there and wait for permission to exit. They're ignoring your body language cues. So, like, for example, if you go and walk out the door and the door is cracked open, you're showing like movement forward, but they're not following you. Like, that's a cue to move. Like, if we're moving and we're going a certain way, that's a cue for them to follow. If you're teaching stay or settle, where they lay down and relax in place, or place, that's another one. Some people call it, where they go to their bed and just lay there and relax no matter what's going on around them. You're teaching a dog to ignore your body language prompts for movement. Because, you know, as soon as you say stay to a puppy, but you start to back away, guess what? They think that's a cue to, oh, we're getting up, we're moving, and they go to follow you. And so, you know, as soon as you start to back away, or if you turn your back to them, then they're confused because they are following your body language, trying to figure out what you want. Because dogs don't speak English. You know, they know certain words that we've taught them, but sometimes we give them too much credit and assume that they know what we want, and then we get frustrated. So they are watching all of your little body language cues, trying to figure out, what does she want? What does she want? And these ones are tough then, you know, with the settle and the place and the stay. Once all of a sudden you want them to remain there in place, but you're adding movement into it, you're asking them to ignore that. So it's not a verbal cue, but where we're telling them to do something different than what they actually should be doing. But you know, I feel like it's almost as strong, because dogs really follow our body language. That means a lot to them. That's how they figure out where they should be, what they should be doing. And another situation where we want them to follow our movement is with heeling. We want them to be moving right next to us, looking for how we're turning or pivoting. And so now all of a sudden we want them to follow our movement. With come, if you're one of the people that starts to move away to build up speed, or you say, hey, come on, you know, move your arm and walk away, you're wanting them to follow it. So these poor dogs, like, they don't know. Sometimes they're not really sure what the context is. And so they're constantly trying to figure out, reading like different environmental context, different stimuli that are present or not, to figure out, well, does she want me to follow her body language, or does she want me to not do this? And so, you know, because that's very strong communication to a dog. So you've already probably taught some of these things. You probably had them ignore it at times, and they understand their job is to stay while you walk around and do something else, or they're supposed to come and follow you at those times, and then they do follow it. You're probably a little more aware of some of this than you realized you were. So let's go on to the next part. So the ultimate expectation of the dog. I want the dog to independently detect rattlesnakes. I want him to make a judgment call based on what his owner is asking him to do and the rattlesnake's location. So, you know, if I cue my dogs to move forward and there's a rattlesnake 10 feet from the trail, I'm okay with that. Like, I'm going to, with my training, the way I train it, I'm okay with that, for them to move forward. If it's 4 feet from the trail, maybe they go around it, you know, like, I don't want them, you know, just plowing ahead. If it's like a foot from the trail, my dog should stop. And so I teach them to make these judgment calls based on what distance I train during the actual like rattlesnake training. So they get comfortable with certain distances, which are rewarded, you know, or not rewarded when they perform the certain behaviors of turning away. You know, if my dog like goes all the way up and sniffs a snake and then turns away, obviously that's not what I want. So the dog, and that's how we start to form like how he makes his judgments. So a dog should maintain a safe distance from the snake no matter what's alluring nearby. I add in food. I even put food near the snake sense. I put another dog, or I stand near it, because my dogs just want to follow me around and do whatever. I want him to understand he has a job. No matter what, you don't go near that snake. But we make it fun. My dog thinks it's so much fun. Because they get rewarded afterwards when they do the right thing. But they know that their job, no matter what, is to stay away from that snake. So handler and environmental cues are handy with this, because, you know, our dogs may not always be next to us. Most likely they're not going to be next to you when they encounter a rattlesnake. So we have our handler cues, you know, specific things that we can verbally cue to our dogs that we've trained. And then you also have your body movements and prompts. And remember how important I mentioned those are. Your dog's always watching you. You may not realize it, but they're figuring out what you want based on the context, based on the situation, or what's nearby. Your dog's always trying to figure out what you want, following those body movements. That's why they know you're going to leave the house long before you ever do, or they know that you're getting ready for bed, or they know what's going on because they're watching you. So these are very important, and we use it during the training. There are the environmental cues that we're going to create. Because right now, you know, like if I were to start a dog with the training, he doesn't know to do anything with the rattlesnake other than to go smell it, which I will never allow. I don't allow that because he's practicing a behavior that I don't want repeated. So I always try to prevent them from doing a behavior if I don't want it to, you know, be done over and over again. Like, you know, I know some trainers allow the dogs to sniff the rattlesnake scent. I don't, because I feel like it only makes them more curious. You know, if I let my dogs go sniff a pole on a walk that lots of dogs have peed on, it's not like it gets it out of their system. They just want to go sniff more urine. They want to sniff more poles. And, you know, in those situations, I'm okay with that because it's not something dangerous. But a rattlesnake is. So to me, it serves no purpose to let him sniff the scent close up. You know, he can sniff it 5 feet away. And then that will cue a behavior that I have them do. So the environmental cues are the visual profile of the snake. which I think is less important to most dogs, but we still provide it because there's no way to ask him how important it is. So we always provide it just in case it has more meaning to him than I realize that it has, because each dog is different. And then the scent, we use a variety of scents because each individual snake smells different. Even though the species of snakes smell different one from the other, even individual snakes smell a little bit different. So we provide a few different scents. And then the noise, you know, the little rattle noise that they make. So risk management, you know, training is not a guarantee of safety. It's only as good, you know, whether it's aversive or it's positive, like no kind of training is any guarantee, because you have to do solid training, but then you also have to maintain it. You know, it's like if you train come when your dog's a puppy and then you never practice it again, and then he's 5 years old and he got out of his harness in a park, who knows if he's going to come or not, because it's not been practiced in so long. It's very rusty. He may not see value in performing the behavior. He may not remember what the behavior is. So you need to maintain these things if it's important to you that your dog performs them. Dogs are living beings. They make their own choices. They're not robots. And he may, you know, be expected to perform a certain behavior, but then he's like, well, there's some, you know, this snake really is that interesting. It's always possible. You know, I don't really see that in my training, but it's entirely possible, you know, because they're living beings. The environmental conditions can really impact whether they can detect it, because, you know, if the dog doesn't know the snake is there, then he can't avoid it. And the wind can blow a certain way, which you'll see if you take my course with some of the training videos, where, like, you know, they'll approach from one angle, like the dog approach from one angle, and they can detect the snake a lot better than from the other angle where the wind is blowing differently. So blowing the scent away. Moisture affects it. If the snake is sitting high up versus down low, like all that makes a difference with detecting the snake from a distance, because we don't want them to be up on top of the snake. We want them to know it's there from a distance. And even management isn't 100% safety. You can have your dog on a leash and he goes and sticks his head in a hole or under a shrub, which, you know, a lot of people let their dogs sniff the edges of shrubs, and there could be a snake in there and you don't know it because it's under leaves and it's trying to escape the heat of the summer. A dog zooming through the woods or zooming through the desert could end up running across the rattlesnake because he's not looking for him. He's just zooming around, having fun. Your dog could be hopping from one boulder to the next, which I see a lot of dogs do out here at Red Rock in Las Vegas. There could be a rattlesnake sitting on one of those. And he's not looking for him. He's just bouncing around, having fun. And he's moving so quickly, he's not going to be able to scent it. So, you know, there's not any 100% safety guarantee. Even if they're on a leash, that's not guaranteed, because that snake could be right next to you and concealed or camouflaged, and you don't know what's there. So will my dog detect and avoid all snakes? I've seen courses advertise that, and to me that's false. It's very unlikely because I think people believe that their dog's going to identify any snake through sight, but that's not how our dogs work. They're much more scent oriented, and they do detect different species of snakes very well through smell, but there's like 50 different species of snakes in the USA, and so that's a lot of different scents that are incredibly unique to a dog. So he may learn to avoid a rattlesnake, but, you know, some copperhead, that's a different smell. He doesn't know to avoid that unless you've taught it to him. And like I mentioned before with a little anecdote about dogs not recognizing their dog's siblings coming in the door, or even their owner coming in the door because they smell different, that just shows how much that smell is a lot more important to a dog than the visual. So, you know, snakes look different too. Some are short and fat, some are long and skinny. They have different patterns on them, which can appear quite different to dogs who see color differently than we do. And, you know, it could be different orientations where it's long and skinny and windy, or one's coiled up, or maybe it's like this and that shape. I don't consider it very likely that they're going to detect it through just a visual. So my assessment is that no, your dog is not going to avoid off snakes most likely. Unless you have a livestock guardian dog, then lucky you, lucky you, because your dog is going to probably bark at that snake, tell him to go away, and not approach him too closely. So yeah, like this is a tough one, because I really wish I could give you the answer that your dog is going to avoid off snakes, but it's just not likely. And so what you can do is train to the venomous ones that are in your area. You know, at least out here, the different species of rattlesnakes, they seem to group together pretty well. So if you train a Western Diamondback scent, it's very similar to the other types of rattlesnakes that are in the area. The Eastern Diamondback, you know, that you see east of the Mississippi, that's a little different. But at least, you know, you can train to the certain venomous ones in your area. So there was a 2018 paper in the Applied Animal Behavior Science, that journal that I mentioned earlier. This is the thing that I referenced, that there were 171 dogs, and they had their scents applied to newspapers, as well as the scent of snails and the scent of mice. And the dogs, they could differentiate the boas from the rattlesnakes. They did not see them as the same thing, but they also weren't afraid of them. But it just goes to show that dogs are seeing the differences between species of snakes and not scenting them as just snakes. And examples of this with you know, actual work that dogs do, the USDA locates brown tree snakes in Guam, because we have a military base over in Guam, and you know, they do flights from some of the other islands around there. You don't want these snakes sneaking their way into the cargo on board, because that's happened before and they become an invasive species there. And so they use dogs to locate these snakes, and they know that they smell different than any other snake. They know that specific species. And then dogs locating Burmese pythons in the Everglades. These are dogs that failed out, they're largely dogs that failed out of the bomb training for the military, and they know the scent of a python because there are tons of snakes in the Everglades. It's kind of scary how many different snakes, a lot of venomous ones, are in the Everglades. But they know the smell of these pythons versus these other snakes. So there are about 50 snake species in the US. That's a lot of different species, because I've heard so many trainers say, well, I just want the dogs to know to avoid off snakes. To me, that's not realistic. And I don't like to promise people anything that I don't think is likely. But what you can do is train to the venomous ones in your area, whether you have, you know, the rattlesnakes, or you have cottonmouth, or you have copperheads, or if you're overseas, like whatever certain venomous ones are in your area, train to those ones, because once you've trained these behaviors to one scent of a snake, it is a lot easier to add on a different scent and expect those same behaviors, because you already trained the behaviors. You just have to let them know there's a new cue for it, this new scent. So it's not an impossible thing. You can apply it to multiple scents. Applying it, expecting it to be 50 different scents, though, that's crazy to me. That's unlikely, but we can do it for the venomous ones in your area. So where do I find a rattlesnake to practice? Yeah, I'm not using live rattlesnakes like I mentioned before. If you want to, it sounds like that's a possibility, but that's not something that I do. So you won't need to adopt a pet rattlesnake. Defanging is a very painful procedure, and it's often deadly within a year or so of it being done, because it causes mouth rot. And mouth rot happens to the snake because they're so stressed out that their immune system is weakened. And so then they get a bacterial infection after the defanging, and then it just ends up killing the snake. So it's pretty gruesome, pretty awful, which is why, like, I don't like to use the live snakes. Well, one of the reasons, because like I mentioned before, I was offered a live snake that wasn't defanged, but I just don't like to stress them out, subjecting them to extreme fear or distress. But that's my personal choice. then also, like with this this type of training, you can get scent articles, visual articles, or even the noise stuff. That's very effective. It's affordable, you know, relatively affordable. You know, you can get all this for like $100 or maybe $200 at most. It's accessible. You know, you should be able to get all that for probably under $100. To me, that's very affordable. And versus like trying to ship in some snake for the weekend or for a few weeks, like that's a lot more difficult to me. So with all this accessible, you know, it makes training very doable to do in your home for just the average person. You know, watch the videos online or go to a workshop and then practice at home with your scent articles, your visual articles. And the thing that I'm trying to highlight here is that this is no different than other training that we do. I feel like we've just been fed these lines that, oh, it can't be done. But even with the intelligent disobedience part, there's a little bit of that people do already. It's just not taken to that level. But people do a little bit of that in their practice at home already with the things that they train. And certainly all of us as trainers do. We just have to take it to another level. So, you know, this type of training, it uses basic foundations your dog may already know, or you wish that they knew. We use the scent and sight as the visual, or as the environmental cues. We already do that as trainers with diabetic dogs and other types of medical alert service dogs. We do this with reactivity training, where the sight of another dog, the dog turns away and reconnects with their owner. Instead of lunging and barking at the other dog. So we do these sorts of things. With the diabetic dogs, they smell and then they perform a certain behavior. So, you know, this is not something that's never been done before. It's just never been done with rattlesnakes. So intelligence disobedience, like I mentioned, some elements exist in other training you already do. So don't psych yourself out about it. You totally got this. You can do this at home. You can do this with clients' dogs. You know, maybe try it with your own dog first and see how it goes. We're just taking concepts and just applying them in different ways, and applying them at another level, and challenging our own biases in the process. Because, you know, so like I said, so many people think that rattlesnakes are the exception to positive reinforcement. Like, we use positive reinforcement except with rattlesnakes, but why? Nobody ever mentioned why, other than they have to be afraid. Well, I've already shown you they don't have to be afraid. You know, my dogs get quite excited to hear about snake games, and so many of these dogs that have gone through my training also are very excited about snake training, but they go nowhere near that snake. They know to stay away. And so you can find better ways of training and communicating with your dog to work as a team, because that's what it's all about, is working as a team. Your dog needs to know what you want and know how to do it. And that's our job, is to figure out how to communicate to them what we want and create these patterns. So I wanted to thank you so much for joining me and listening to me. I have a free gift for all the attendees. Yo and Michelle will send it out very quickly here, so it'll be accessible immediately to you. Stay tuned here for the Q&A. My dogs, they were so quiet during this, so I'm going to take a brief break and go give them a little treat for being so good. But feel free to contact me with any questions. There's my email address and also my business website, so feel free to reach out. And thanks again.